Hello, and welcome to Ellroy Reads. This is a show where every week I look at a book that was an influence on James Ellroy. I have a fantastic book for you this week, and I have a fantastic episode. But firstly, welcome to all our new subscribers. I'm determined to make this your favorite book show on the web. And if you're watching and you haven't subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button now, hit the like button. I promise you won't regret it. Okay, our book for this week's show is the all-time classic, The Collector by John Fowles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Fowles as an author, a little bit about The Collector, and then I'm going to finish off by telling a story about a real-life murder case of which there was a connection to this novel, The Collector, and Ellroy's own investigation of that murder case. Okay. So John Fowles was born in Leigh-on-Sea in 1926, and he was a very promising young man. He won a place in private school and also was educated at the University of Oxford. And he actually accepted a commission for the Royal Marines shortly after the end of World War II. And he completed his commission, but he began to despise what he was becoming. He was becoming an establishment figure, being trained as an officer and a young man, but still the British Empire, just about. He didn't want to become that person, and he was becoming very influenced by existentialist and absurdist philosophy at university, and that began to chime with his own views. So he took a change of direction. He became a teacher. He ended up teaching at a university in France and also in the Greek islands. And that's where he met his wife, Elizabeth, who was married to a fellow teacher. At the time, they had a stormy affair, and there was a rather ugly divorce that followed. And he continued teaching in the UK, and he began writing his first novel, The Collector, and it was published in the early 1960s, and it was just a massive, massive success. He was able to quit teaching right away, and he went on to continue that success. His next book was actually a collection of essays, which his publishers highly advised him against. They said that's not commercial, but he insisted. Nevertheless, it was successful, and he continued to write extremely successful novels. The Magus, which was inspired by his stay on the Greek islands and Greek mythology, and the French lieutenant's woman, very famous story with more than one ending. And he actually ended his days in Lyme Regis, which is where the French lieutenant's woman is based. And he curated the local museum, and was considered something of a recluse. He turned his back on literary fame, although he continued writing. His output slowed a little bit before his death in 2005 at the age of 79. He continued writing, but he was not quite J.D. Salinger, but fairly reclusive. He didn't do many interviews, and when he did, he often came across as fairly irascible. Anyway, The Collector is a kind of classic crime story in terms of it's really a two-hander. So our male character, Freddie Clegg, is this reclusive, quite virginal young man, sexually inadequate young man, who collects butterflies as a hobby and has them, encased. And he becomes sexually obsessed with a young woman, a beautiful young woman, Miranda, who is studying at the Slade School of Art, a very promising artist. He doesn't know her. He follows her around. He becomes kind of obsessed with her personality, and what he can glean from her personality by just observing her incognito. And he hatches this plan to kidnap her. Now he's just come into money because he's won the football pools, which was the old gambling system before the National Lottery, and he's come into like £60,000 or more. And in the 1960s, trust me, that was a lot of money. He kidnaps her with chloroform, knocking her out. He takes her to this large house which he's bought in the Sussex countryside, very remote, and he keeps her in the cellar. And when she comes to, she's petrified. She is furious. Everything you would expect. And she's like, "Well, what do you want from me? Why can't I leave?" And it turns out he just wants her company. At one point, she gets so desperate, she even kind of offers him some, sexual acts just as a desperate plea to escape. But as we soon learn, he's very sexually inadequate. He's impotent. He cannot love a woman in that way. He really wants her company, or rather, he wants to collect her like his butterflies, and he wants just another beautiful thing in his possession. But he wants to control her, and not just by keeping her in the cell. He wants to control what she likes, what she eats, what she wears. He wants to take photographs of her. Now, the first half of the novel is from Clegg's first person narration, and it's about the planning of the crime. The crime goes across quite smoothly, the kidnapping. Then, when he's got her in his captivity, uh, it starts to fall apart because human beings cannot be controlled in the way that he wants. They cannot be collected in the way that he wants to collect them. He becomes quite shocked at her opinions. She calls him Caliban, and he tells her from The Tempest, this kind of like monstrous figure, but in an odd way, kind of attractive. He's been cast out of the world. He doesn't belong to the world. He's not like a productive member of society. In some ways, you begin to think that she feels sorry for him. And of course, she's Miranda, and he tells her his name is Ferdinand, who is the character who eventually wins Miranda's hand in The Tempest. Then halfway through the novel, we have just a stroke of genius in terms of it switches to Miranda's viewpoint in terms of a diary that she keeps secretly during her captivity about what it's like for her there, out of sheer boredom and frustration. And we see a replaying of some of the events that Clegg, as Ferdinand, Frederick, whatever you want to call him, her captor, has described. And we see them very differently. And we begin to think, well, this man is a very unreliable narrator. Although, in a sense, Miranda might also be a very unreliable narrator. We have two unreliable narrators in this story. She goes a lot into her backstory and about a relationship she'd been having with a much older artist. And that's very interesting in itself because this older artist is kind of promising in one level in terms of his art career, but is also facing kind of disappointments as he storms towards middle age. He's twice her age. He's old enough to be a father. And there's a lot of toing and froing in terms of, do I love him? Would it ever work out, him being so older? And there's a sense that she has been emotionally manipulated by this older man because he's had some artistic success. He's got a certain hold over her, emotional hold over her, and that in itself is a kind of form of captivity. There's lots of discussions about obviously God or the lack of existence of God. There's games there's mind games in terms of Miranda perhaps affecting an affection for her captor in a way so she kind of walks in the garden and this sort of thing. She's kind of giving him a certain amount of affection or adoration, which is what he really wants, in order to buy herself some freedom. I think I've said enough now in terms of before we start to get to the ending, and I don't want to give anything away. But this truly is a great novel, and I think Fowles' genius is that he could mix literary fiction with a mystery storyline. Although we got a very tetchy when people called this a crime story, because obviously he had grand ambitions in terms of scaling the heights of literary fiction, which he achieved. There's no questions asked, but he didn't really like this being referred to as a crime story. And, well, its effect on James Ellroy was profound. And it actually bears a very strong resemblance to a book that was published later, and it was actually the first novel I covered on this show, Ellroy Reads. Scroll down the playlist and rewatch the episode if you're so inclined. Irving Wallace's The Fan Club. And that's very similar in terms of, although the kidnapped victim is a famous actress, billed by a publicity as a sex pot, four guys, not one guy, but four guys become obsessed with her, they kidnap her, and they're under the illusion that they can make her fall in love with them over the course of her captivity. Very similar story, very similar ending as well. I think it's probably inevitable that Irving Wallace probably read The Collector, because The Collector was actually huge in the US, much bigger there than it was in the UK. And yeah, I think, it's a strong connection there. So James Ellroy read the novel in the summer of 1965 and was greatly impressed with it. And he went to see the film version, which was released in 1965 and starred Terence Stamp as Ferdinand and Samantha Eggar as Miranda. And it's well worth a watch if you haven't seen it already. Although, really, this is a book show, so I recommend books first. You read the book first. The book is better, but the film is actually really, really good. And it's sad because only this last year we've lost both Terence Stamp and Samantha Eggar. They both died recently. And it was one of their best performances all year round. Although when I read Samantha Eggar's obituary, I only found out she was bullied relentlessly during the production. To make her feel like Miranda, to make her feel like she was trapped in this film set, and to make her feel, humiliated. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. As direction or an acting technique, but it's a great film. Ellroy went to see that film during the Watts riots, and described it as being kind of surreal, with LA burning down all around him, and he's in the cinema watching this scene, watching this film about captive beings. But he said the film reminded him of his mother. Samantha Eggar has this very striking red hair, and Ellroy's mother was a redhead. Very different story. Ellroy's mother was murdered. The story is kind of an unsolved murder. Well, it was a very different scenario. It was, date rape went bad. She was seen in a bar with this guy. She was on a date. She'd consented to go on a date with this guy, which is a very different story. But nevertheless, in terms of the female victim, in terms of a woman being abused by a man, it reminded him of his mother. Now let's fast forward. Over the years in the US, there have been a number of cases of kidnap and murder and rape which have been inspired, which have been linked to the collector. Now, I'm not going to go into the dangers of art and the dangers of art inspiring, crimes. That's a whole, we could talk about, A Clockwork Orange, the Kubrick film, which Kubrick took out of circulation himself because he was worried about it inspiring crimes. I'm not going to go into that debate. But there were a number of cases, and I'll name them. Bob Berdella was a Kansas City serial killer who was kidnapping young men and keeping them in his workshop and torturing them sexually. And when he was finally caught, he was inspired by the collector. He said that novel and film was an inspiration to him. And Ellroy actually made a documentary about Bob Berdella. And that came about because Ellroy lived in Mission Hills, Kansas City. That's a very plush suburb of Kansas City. He lived there for 5-6 years with his second wife, Helen Canode. And he loved it there. And he got roped into making this documentary. Unfortunately, the documentary Bizarre, which was the name of Bob Berdella's curiosity shop, actually shop of horrors. The documentary was made by Troma, who produced these exploitation horror films. Anyway, the documentary is appalling. And Ellroy, when I spoke to him when I was writing his biography, he was just appalled at the memory of it. He really regretted doing it. He's like, I'm too nice. The guy who directed it was my insurance agent. And it turned out dreadfully. But nevertheless, that is a connection. It's a real life case that Ellroy talked about, and that's connected to the collector. But the more substantial case that Ellroy was much more fascinated by was the murder of Stephanie Gorman, who was a teenage girl who was murdered in her home in 1965 in Los Angeles, in an upper middle class area of Los Angeles. Her father was a lawyer, Ed Gorman, Jewish family. She was found shot to death, shot 4 times in her bedroom. and it was believed that it was just a rape case that resulted in murder. Something happened to trigger the murder. Now, years later, Ellroy began investigating this when he actually wrote a GQ article about it, titled Stephanie. The article is very unusual because really, Ellroy writes of himself as kind of like Ferdinand in The Collector. That's how he saw himself. He saw himself as this character. It's kind of brave of him to admit that, but Stephanie was a young Jewish girl. Ellroy was attending Fairfax High, which was a predominantly Jewish school in Los Angeles. He was like one of the very few Gentile students there. And he had no social skills like Ferdinand. And he said that I was at that age, I was in adolescence and I was becoming obsessed with girls, pretty girls, and I would follow them. And he said he didn't know Stephanie, but the actual line he uses in the GQ article was, "Would I have followed a girl like Stephanie and observed her? Yes. Would I have heard a hair on her head? No, absolutely not." But nevertheless, the case got interesting because it was reactivated as a cold case by Rick Jackson, who was working, a very famous LAPD detective, one of the inspirations for Michael Connelly's Bosch. He was investigating it as a cold case years later, and it transpired that shortly before her murder, Stephanie and her sister Cheryl had gone on holiday to Coronado, and they'd met some boys there. And, they were all teenagers. There was a little bit of flirting going on. And Cheryl, the sister, said that she was reading The Collector. And actually, the four of them played a game where the girls were tied up and they reenacted a scene from The Collector, very clumsily, very hammily. Anyway, the police thought that this link was substantial enough that they actually traced the boys down. And, they confirmed what had happened. They said it was a harmless game, but they had alibis for the day that Stephanie was murdered, that they were not involved in any way. But there we have it. When Ellroy, because this is like the early 2000s when he was investigating the Stephanie Gorman murder, Ellroy read this link to The Collector. He's like, I don't believe it, in terms of like, I read that book that summer. I thought it was brilliant. I went to see the film, Samantha Eggar, the redhead, my mother. It just sparked this chain of connections. And he could vaguely remember seeing like Los Angeles Times newspaper headline where Stephanie Gorman was on the front cover and just think, oh, there's a young girl been murdered. But watching the film and the Watts riots and everything that was going on, there's a link there to The Collector. And the murder of Stephanie Gorman is still unsolved. There is actually a link that they have a hot lead, Rick Jackson, which they investigate, and Ellroy goes into in the article. Stephanie, unfortunately, draws a blank. And there is actually a link. The Stephanie Gordon murder case links to another crime novel, which I'm going to cover in a future episode, which I won't go into now. But one of the cold case detectives who was working on the case was a guy called Dave Lamkin. And he and Ellroy became close. Rick Jackson introduced him to him. And they would talk scenarios. And Ellroy was reading the murder cases. And he read the Stephanie Gorman murder case from cover to cover. And he became quite an expert in how to read a murder case. Like, facts diverge, they converge, they form scenarios and theories. You can't get too tied to any scenario. Actually, Bill Stoner told him that when he was investigating his mother's murder, because that scenario can fall apart at any minute just when you think you've solved it. But Lamkin was very much of the opinion that the scenario was that this was a rapist who was, attacking women at the time. And he was known to be quite a skittish rapist, or restless rapist, they would call him, in terms of, like, he was very easily spooked, and, he got scared. And what happens is, he thinks that this man either lied his way into the Stephanie Gorman household, or forced his way in, and something happened that interrupted his original intention just to rape her. he got scared and he shot her dead. And Lemkin's view was that there are many men who have the capacity to murder, but they don't do it. But those that do it, not necessarily talking about the Ted Bundys and the Jeffrey Dahmers of the world who have this overwhelming urge to kill and become serial killers. Those that have the capacity to murder, but don't necessarily have the compulsion to murder, occasionally events will converge where they're just accidentally triggered and they will kill someone. Dave Lemkin thought that's what happened in the Stephanie Gorman case. Ellroy agreed with him because he told Lemkin this. He's like, I think that's what happened with with the murder of my mother. You know, she was on a date that night with her murderer, who became known as the Swarthy Man, if you read Ellroy's Mark Dark Places. Now, her murderer had agreed to go on a date with her. There was another woman who was kind of chaperoning them at the time. They were seen in bars and diners. It seems unlikely that he had planned to kill her all along. If he was going to be if there were waitresses and there were other people around who could identify him, but something triggered him that night, and he did end up killing her. I'm not saying that this is an excuse or anything. I'm not trying to say anything now. I'm just talking about the pathology of the killer. And he probably didn't kill again, in Ellroy's view. In Stoner's view, Bill Stoner's view, who investigated the case with him, he did kill again. Stoner was of the opinion that he really was a serial killer, or he became one. But it is interesting that the murder of Stephanie Gorman and the murder of Geneva Hilliker Ellroy, Ellroy's mother, that they have this scenario in common. And of course, there is a link between this classic crime novel and numerous crime cases that Ellroy investigated, most specifically the murder of Stephanie Gorman. Okay, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. I'll be back next week with another classic novel for another episode of Ellroy Reads. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.